Hello, my name is Emily Menhorn, and today I'm going to be presenting on interpersonal communication. The way I'm going to present today and about interpersonal communication is really based off of my own personal experience and education and the reflection on interpersonal communication personally, in hopes that maybe you can reflect and review the content I'll be sharing and personalize it to yourself. So, I'll be giving you an overarching goal of mine, and then I will dive into my behavioral blend and background. After looking at my behavioral blend and background, I will identify the strengths and weaknesses within myself and some communication barriers that I have. And after identifying those, we're going to take a look at some resources that are out there and some strategic planning that could better communication after looking at those barriers. And then forming real action plans that I can start implementing in order to achieve that goal that I'll be addressing to you in this next slide. So, my overarching goal is to foster a safe and therapeutic relationship with others by communicating with openness and transparency while listening with empathy and mindfulness. I am a music therapist and I work with pediatric patients, and so creating a safe space for my clients to be able to open up and feel like they can express truly what they're feeling is an utmost importance for me. And through what we're about to talk about, we know that communicating with openness and transparency will help create that space for expressiveness within my clients and family and friends as well, not just clients. And listening also plays a big role, and so I want to listen with empathy and mindfulness, which kind of just leads into that openness and transparency as well. So before we dive in, what is interpersonal communication? We have to start with that. So as you can look at my slide, there's a sliding scale model of impersonal and interpersonal, where impersonal is really when you're talking to a person that is filling a role. That might be a bank teller, that might be a cashier, or your Uber driver, or any of those kind of roles, your waiter maybe. And then our interpersonal is really having a relationship with another person, getting to know them on a deeper level. And impersonal and interpersonal can really occur within all of our members that or roles that are in our life. For example, my mother, I could treat her very impersonal sometimes, like calling her every day and just saying, hey, how's your day? And not truly having a connection with her versus when she's stressed and talking about work and us having a deeper connection. So sometimes we go through the motions. Obviously, we know we walk past people and we say, good morning, how are you? And are we really listening? Or is that just a one-liner? So that's kind of where impersonal and interpersonal fall. And we're going to be discussing on how to build those interpersonal relationships through effective communication. To talk just a little bit more about communication is when you hear that word, or when I did, I always thought of talking. Communicating is talking. But we know through lots of studies, research, books, of years of focusing on communication, we know that it's not just talking, it's also listening. And so interpersonal maximizes the presence of personal. In Stewart's book, he talked about inhaling. And so when you're inhaling, you're listening, your perception of verbal and nonverbal cues is happening, and it's really important to pay attention. And when we exhale, that's when we are talking, essentially, in our communication. And we want to stay open and commit to clarity, which also kind of means that we need to express and be empowered and able to talk in an open mind and with clear clarity. So the next slide, there's some pictures of myself and constructing identity. So personally, I can construct my identity when someone says, give me your 5 characteristics. And then other people can create identities on us. And then there's also cultural identities, and all over the place, multiple aspects play a role in our identity. So I wanted to first kind of just out of the blue list some things that off the top of my head I felt described me and constructing my identity. So I think I'm an extrovert. I think I'm Christ-centered, service-driven, family-oriented. I love lists and checking them off, and I'm very competitive. But then I took a look at Uniquely You, which is a resource that takes a look. You take a test and looks at your 4 spiritual gifts and profiles you. And so I'm just going to go over this quickly. You can look at it later. But we have D, which is in yellow. If you're high in that, you're going to be dominating, demanding, decisive, probably a really big leader. And then I, you're going to be in the orange, and you're going to be inspiring, influencing, very people-driven. If you're blue in the S, you're going to be steady, stable. I don't like the word submissive, but you will be kind of taking a role back in the sense. And C, in the green, you're going to be passive yet task-oriented, so cautious yet competent. And you're kind of like the sly person who knows what they're doing, but kind of just does it under the radar, which is kind of great. So after taking the exam, I looked at my results, and you can see I am high in I and high in S, which really is almost like black and white, yin and yang a little bit, because it means that I am an extrovert, but I also can be an introvert. And I have high people skills, which doesn't surprise me at all. I'm not very dominant or demanding. That's why the D is pretty low on both. And I don't have to be a leader. I'm not pushy. And so very much people-driven and people-oriented and not demanding. Also, the top one is how people view me and how they see me. And the second grid, I didn't explain that, I apologize. The second grid is how I view myself. And you can see how the C actually is really different from 0 to 21. And that really means from an outstander, or from an outlier who's looking at me, it shows that I am not a risk taker and a people pleaser, where I feel I'm more of a risk taker. I did say that right. And so it's just different, and it's really interesting to see how other people view you and how you view yourself. And that was a really big insight for me. So after looking at those things, I really sat and thought, okay, so I'm people-oriented, but not dominating. What is a barrier? Something that I need to work on, and that would be speaking up, seeking clarity. And I definitely have that barrier when I'm communicating with people. I just want to be the listener. I just want to sit next to someone and be supportive. But sometimes you have to speak up, and I'll talk a little bit more in some other slides as to why that's important. So some tips and tricks would be to avoid always and never, and explaining my why when I'm talking, and being empowered. So those kind of tips are just saying, one, my voice matters, and that giving your opinion doesn't mean that you're being rude if you explain your why behind it. And it's never this is always right, you're wrong. It's just my viewpoint, and explaining that is what you can do if trying to communicate clearer and speaking up. The second barrier is listening. Although I'm a people person, and like I said, I love to just sit and listen, am I truly listening and focusing in? Or am I just being a presence and a body for someone? And I want to really focus on that, focus on my listening skills, spending versus investing. I'm a quality time person. I've learned that through taking other tests, and that's great. But in my quality time, am I investing in them? And so aiming my posture, eye contact, and responsive sounds, as well as just clearly restating what they're saying, helps reveal to you that you are listening. You're not just is really important. The third barrier is being open. Now, I don't mean just being present and being open. I mean self-disclosure. I find when I am communicating, because I am people-driven, I want to just focus on them. Where we find that self-disclosure in an appropriate manner can bring your therapeutic relationship or your personal relationship even closer, because you're disclosing personal things. So depth of time, space, touch, and in-depth self-disclosure can really go a long ways in creating interpersonal communication. So some tips for that would be engaging in self-acceptance and self-awareness and trust. Know your audience and listen well. The big one for me is self-acceptance. So usually when I'm communicating with people, whether that be family members or clients, is they are more important than me. And I think we need to shift our mind and not bash myself or ourselves in that content. That accepting myself and being aware of that and trusting that my input or my self-disclosure could help another person in an appropriate setting, though. It doesn't always need to be about you at the same time. But that's a big one for me, is really opening up and letting people in versus just being a vessel and someone to be present, right? Being intentional in my listening and my conversation. So France talked more on levels of reflection, and this is something that I really wanted to focus on for me. So I found a resource on this, and he talks about different reflections: factual, surface, and underlying, and I'm just going to touch quickly on those. But factual reflection is you're not really focusing on your emotions, just the facts, kind of just going through. And then surface feeling reflection is maybe an emotion is very identified in your conversation. You can tell they're angry. They said words that I'm mad or this upsets me. But then underlying reflections are much deeper reflections that go beyond just surface level or facts. It's really a part of them. And so I want to be more intentional with reflecting on myself before, during, and after communication, because identifying those feelings will go a long ways in being able to help them communicate, which is one of my barriers. Another resource is Peterson came up with the talker listener cards. I think these are great. At first I was like, I feel like a child doing this, but sometimes we really just need that straight up reminder of who is talking and who is listening, and that's really what these cards are for. It's just like taking turns, and sometimes when there's a lot of emotion, or as Peterson says, the flat brain syndrome, which is when we're kind kind of just tapped out emotionally, physically, we're done. This can be a good reset and reminder of roles during communication. It sounds silly, but I think it can really be helpful. And then listening and feedback. Richardson talked about um, active listening. So going back again, and really importance of being intentional in our listening. I love how he said it's feedback. I never really thought of it as listening is also feedback in the moment. And he kind of goes on like this. If I'm listening, however I'm listening, it's giving that person already feedback. Depending on how I look, depending on my responses, they're going to already know if I've accepted them, if I've rejected them, if I truly am listening and understanding, or if I've judged. And so he goes on to give some really great tips, some practical ones. He listed a whole bunch, but I pulled some that maybe we haven't talked about already in this conversation. So selecting a time and a place that makes listening easy. So you're not going to have a conversation in a hallway where people are coming back and forth. You're not going to have a conversation on the street. So finding a quiet spot. Avoiding strict time restraints. This is a big one for me. I'm always looking at my phone. I'm a lister, so I plan out my day, but really having that open time. So valuable and a great reminder that Richardson says. And realizing that you can listen without giving advice. Such a big one. Sometimes we feel like we want to be the hero. I know I definitely want to be. It makes me feel good being a people person that I am. But knowing that sometimes just you listening and not judging and understanding and accepting is exactly what's needed. And then the last thing I wanted to just bring up is Vertino talked about ineffective interpersonal communication. So I know we've talked the whole presentation about the positives and building interpersonal communication, but I just wanted to be clear that it's a tango. You are a person, and then you're going to be talking to another person, and they might not have great interpersonal communications, or maybe you don't have great ones and you need to work on it. So one should be mindful that there are ineffective interpersonal communicators out there, and here are some of the things that could be going on with them. Cultural taboo, no talk, so that just means there are some things that people, they're not allowed to talk about. That is not okay in their culture. Poor conflict management, they just have the lack of empathy. Poor self-image, lack of boundaries, and importance of insight. I just wanted to bring those up and have you look at those because, like it says on my slide, human rapport requires creativity and flexibility. So these scripts, this card, it's not always going to be that easy. You might be working with someone who really needs to gain their interpersonal communication, and just being able to be creative and be flexible, knowing that these are probably some lacking areas that are happening with them. It's always great to just be aware. So I wanted to kind of bring that to the forefront too. So now that we've talked about all of interpersonal communication, personally, some of my barriers, and then some great tips and tricks, created some action plans that I think if I do on a consistency, it will help me be able to better and reach that goal that I had at the very beginning. And so my action plan is to journal daily. I chose that action plan because I want to promote more self-awareness and reflection. And so by journaling daily will help me. And then reaching out to one friend weekly. I just moved from Oklahoma to Ohio, so a lot of my friends are back there. And so I think it would be great to utilize connecting with them still and really listening to them. And so I want to reach out to a friend once weekly and practice mindful listening skills. And so the third action plan then is to minimize using the term never mind and exchange it with addressing my thoughts and opinions. So I catch myself often in a lot of my relationships where I have something I want to say and I just say, never mind. I want to stop myself because I need to practice on speaking up and being clear. And so trying to have that buzzword ingrained in my head that once I hear that, I need to change my action. And so I think that will really be tough to do, but I think will really move along my growth in interpersonal communication and really having better self-disclosure and opening up to people. And so, in summary, one, I hope that what we talked about, I know it was really reflected on myself, but I hope that you can take something either from what I'm dealing with and what I'm trying to work on in my personal communication skills, or maybe you're able to reflect on areas that you need. I hope that this kind of gives you some resources and some tips because I think we all need to be better in this area, because Ralph Nichols, I put it on the slide, the most basic of all human needs is the need to understand and be understood. And that's really what interpersonal communication is to understand other people and then also to communicate your thoughts and feel understood. And so interpersonal communication, simple, maybe it seems simple, but it is so, so, so valuable to humans and to our nature of human beings. So next is my references of all of the content that I have kind of gathered and put on this slide. I hope you've taken something from this, and I hope you have a great day.